When a narcissistic woman begins to feel that her control over you is slipping, something very predictable often happens next. She doesn't usually confront the loss of control directly. Instead, she begins to reshape the narrative around you. Quietly, subtly at first, she starts speaking to others, friends, family, colleagues, and she does it in a way that seems almost innocent. She presents herself as hurt, misunderstood, even wounded. And slowly, a story begins to form. What makes this strategy so effective is not simply the lie itself, but the emotional packaging around it. People are naturally sympathetic to someone who appears vulnerable. So the narcissistic individual rarely launches a loud attack. She tells half-truths. She shares selective memories. She leaves out the parts that would expose her behavior and magnifies the parts that make you appear cold, distant, or cruel. In this way, the narrative spreads almost organically, as if people are discovering it themselves rather than being persuaded. Psychologically, this tactic serves a very specific purpose. It protects the narcissist's image. Deep down, the narcissistic personality cannot tolerate the idea of being seen as flawed or responsible for the breakdown of a relationship. That would threaten the fragile identity they work so hard to maintain. So instead, the mind constructs a defense. If others believe you are the problem, then her self-image remains intact. You may suddenly notice a shift in the atmosphere around you. Conversations become colder. Some people seem distant. Others treat you with subtle suspicion. And what makes this moment so disorienting is that you know the story being told about you is incomplete or entirely false. Yet it seems to have gained traction before you even realized it had begun. This is the beginning of what psychologists often call a smear campaign. But understanding it changes everything. Because once you recognize that this is not about truth, but about control, the confusion starts to dissolve. And the most important realization is this: when someone must destroy your reputation to protect their own image, they have already revealed more about themselves than they ever intended. Once this narrative begins to circulate, a difficult question naturally arises. Why do people believe it so easily? Why do friends, acquaintances, sometimes even family members accept the story without first seeking your perspective? The answer lies less in your behavior and more in the subtle psychology of persuasion. A narcissistic personality often develops an extraordinary ability to shape perception. Over time, they learn how to present themselves in ways that evoke sympathy, trust, and emotional protection from others. They do not simply tell a story, they perform it. Their tone, their expressions, even the timing of their words are carefully chosen to create an emotional impression. And human beings, by nature, are far more responsive to emotion than to objective analysis. Most people are not trained to detect manipulation. They hear someone speaking with apparent sincerity, perhaps even with tears in their eyes, and their instinct is to comfort rather than question. In everyday life, this instinct is usually a virtue. But in the presence of someone skilled in emotional manipulation, that same instinct becomes a vulnerability. Another reason people initially believe the narrative is that it often contains fragments of truth. The narcissistic individual rarely invents everything from nothing. Instead, they take small pieces of reality, an argument that happened, a moment when you were frustrated, A misunderstanding that occurred, and they reshape it. Context disappears. Motives are reversed. What was once a complex human interaction becomes a simple moral story, one person as the victim, the other as the villain. This simplification is powerful because the human mind prefers clear stories. We are uncomfortable with ambiguity. We like to know who is right and who is wrong. And so, when presented with a compelling narrative, many people accept it, without realizing that they have only been shown a carefully edited version of the truth. But time has a way of revealing what emotion initially conceals. Patterns emerge, contradictions appear, and gradually, people begin to sense that something in the story does not quite align with reality. And this is the quiet lesson beneath it all. Manipulation may win attention in the beginning, but truth has patience. And patience is far more powerful than performance. As this narrative spreads, and people begin to distance themselves, something deeper is happening beneath the surface. The goal is not simply to damage your reputation. The deeper objective is isolation. Because isolation is one of the most effective ways to weaken a person psychologically. Human beings are social by nature. Our sense of identity, confidence, and emotional stability is often reinforced by the people around us. Friends remind us who we are. Family reflects our values back to us. Even casual social connections give us a sense that we belong to something larger than ourselves. When those connections begin to disappear, the ground beneath a person can start to feel unstable. This is precisely why isolation becomes such a powerful strategy in narcissistic dynamics. If enough people begin to question you, ignore you, or pull away from you, a subtle psychological pressure begins to form. You may start asking yourself uncomfortable questions. Did I do something wrong? Did I misjudge the situation? Why does everyone seem to see something in me that I don't see in myself? These questions can quietly erode confidence. From a psychological perspective, this erosion of certainty is incredibly useful to someone who seeks control. When a person becomes unsure of their own reality, they become easier to influence, easier to silence, and sometimes even easier to draw back into the very relationship that harmed them. But here is the deeper philosophical insight that is often overlooked. Isolation does not automatically mean that you are wrong. In fact, throughout history, individuals who challenged unhealthy dynamics often found themselves temporarily standing alone. Social rejection, in many cases, says more about the group's need for comfort than it does about the individual's character. The key in this moment is awareness. When you recognize isolation as a strategy rather than a reflection of your worth, something powerful happens internally. The confusion begins to lose its grip, and clarity starts to return. And that realization leads to a simple but profound truth. When someone must isolate you to maintain their power, they are not revealing your weakness. They are revealing their fear. When a person realizes that their reputation is being quietly attacked, the first instinct is often to fight back. You want to correct the story, explain the truth, defend your character. And this reaction is completely human. After all, when your integrity is questioned, silence can feel almost like surrender. But in situations involving narcissistic manipulation, the impulse to constantly defend yourself can sometimes pull you deeper into the very conflict the other person wants to create. A narcissistic personality thrives on reaction. Attention, argument, emotional intensity. These become forms of fuel. When you chase every rumor, respond to every accusation, or attempt to correct every misunderstanding, you unknowingly keep the drama alive. The conversation continues to revolve around the narrative they started. And in that environment, truth often becomes secondary to spectacle. This is where something counterintuitive becomes powerful restraint. Not passive resignation, but deliberate self-control. Instead of trying to win every conversation, you step back and focus on something far more important, your own stability. You continue living with integrity. You keep your actions consistent with your values. You allow your behavior, over time, to speak more clearly than any argument ever could. From a psychological standpoint, this approach shifts the entire dynamic. When there is no emotional reaction to feed on, the cycle of manipulation begins to weaken. The drama that once seemed compelling starts to lose its energy. People who were initially captivated by the story may begin to notice something curious. The person they were warned about does not behave the way the story predicted. And this quiet consistency can be more persuasive than any defense speech. It demonstrates emotional maturity, discipline, and self-respect. In many ways, it reflects a deeper philosophical truth, that a person's character is not proven by how loudly they argue, but by how steadily they live. Over time, this composure becomes its own form of power, not the loud power of confrontation, but the quiet power of self-mastery. And the lesson here is simple but profound. When you refuse to fight in the arena of manipulation, you begin to win in the arena of truth.
As time passes, something interesting begins to happen. The narrative that once seemed so convincing slowly starts to encounter reality. And reality has a way of testing every story. At first, people may have accepted what they were told because it sounded emotionally compelling. But human beings are observant, even if it takes time for those observations to form a clear picture. When someone consistently engages in manipulation, patterns begin to reveal themselves. Perhaps the same kind of conflict appears in multiple relationships. Perhaps the same emotional drama repeats itself with different people. Gradually, individuals who once believed the story may start to notice inconsistencies. They may see moments where the behavior they were warned about simply does not match what they actually experience with you. This is the quiet power of time. Manipulation often depends on urgency and emotion. It spreads quickly because it captures attention. But truth operates differently. It moves slowly, almost patiently, waiting for experience to replace assumption. And when people witness behavior over a long enough period, they begin to trust their own observations more than the story they were originally told. From a psychological perspective, this moment is deeply significant. It represents the collapse of the illusion. The narcissistic personality relies heavily on maintaining a carefully constructed image. But when cracks appear in that image, the same people who once accepted the narrative may begin asking questions. Not aggressively, not all at once, but quietly within their own minds. They may notice exaggerations. They may sense contradictions. They may even recall moments where the narrative seemed slightly too dramatic to be entirely true. And slowly, the perception shifts. What once appeared to be certainty becomes doubt. What is important here is that none of this requires you to wage a public battle. It requires patience and consistency. When your actions remain steady while the story around you keeps changing, the contrast eventually becomes impossible to ignore. And this leads to a powerful realization. Truth rarely needs to shout to be heard. It simply needs time to be seen. And eventually the focus begins to shift away from the conflict itself and towards something far more meaningful, your own transformation. Because after the confusion, the isolation, and the long period of silence, a person is often left with a profound question. Asterisk, what do I do with this experience? Asterisk, many people remain trapped in the desire for vindication. They wait for the moment when everyone will finally see the truth, when the narrative will collapse publicly, and when their name will be fully restored. But there is a deeper psychological turning point that occurs when a person realizes that their real power does not lie in reclaiming the approval of others. It lies in rebuilding themselves. Experiences like these have a strange way of forcing self-reflection. You begin to examine your boundaries, your instincts, and the parts of yourself that may have tolerated unhealthy dynamics for longer than they should have. And in this reflection, something important begins to develop. Awareness. Not the painful awareness of betrayal, but the constructive awareness that helps you grow beyond the experience. This is where the philosophy often associated with thinkers like Carl Jung becomes especially relevant. Jung believed that difficult experiences, even deeply painful ones, can serve as catalysts for psychological growth. When a person confronts the darker aspects of human behavior and learns from them, they begin to develop a stronger and more integrated sense of self. Instead of being defined by the story someone tried to impose on you, you begin to define yourself through your choices moving forward. You become more selective about the people you trust. You strengthen your emotional independence. You invest more energy into purpose, discipline, and personal development rather than into defending your past. Ironically, this transformation often becomes the moment when the entire dynamic loses its power. The person who once tried to control your image no longer has influence over the direction of your life. Your focus has moved beyond them entirely, and perhaps that is the most profound form of closure. Not revenge, not validation, but growth. Because in the end, the greatest response to manipulation is not proving someone wrong. It is becoming someone stronger than the version of yourself they tried to break.